Are Easter and Passover the same thing? What do you think? I've actually been asked about this misunderstanding of Easter and Passover being together on the calendar a couple of times. And for some reason, we Christians seem to think that the two are virtually the same event. The first problem with this is, well, Easter is a celebration of Jesus risen from the grave. What we know is the Last Supper was actually a Passover meal. And so while the events of the crucifixion and resurrection occur at the same time as the Passover festival, we don't celebrate them at the same time. At least not intentionally, and we'll get a little more on that later. What we recognize as Good Friday is the more appropriate link to Passover. Jesus ate the Passover with his disciples in the upper room. Later that night, he's arrested and taken before Pilate. And before nightfall, the end of Passover, he will be crucified. Now, I should take a second to talk about Jewish days. Now, we think of a day starting at midnight and ending at midnight. A Jewish day starts at sundown and ends at sundown. So Jesus would eat the Passover meal at the beginning of the day and be crucified later, almost 20 hours later, that same day. Well, let's talk a little bit about calendars. A Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar, and that means each month is 29 or 30 days long. The calendar we use today in the Western world is the Gregorian calendar. Now, Pope Gregory didn't invent it. That was done by a doctor named Luigi Lilio or Luigi Giglio or some other name. Luigi shows it to Gregory, and Gregory sanctions it in 1582, and it takes almost 400 years before all the Western world finally adopts it. The calendar Luigi invented takes into account the notion that the Earth travels around the Sun in 365.2425 days. Now, you ever wonder why we have leap years every 4 years, except on years that are divisible by 100, except on years that are divisible by 400? It's all to adjust for that 0.2425 days each year. Now, the Jewish calendar is similar to our solar calendar, but the adjustments are a little more coarse. Okay, a lot more coarse. If we look at the two calendars side by side, we can lay out our Gregorian calendar first, starting in January, which has 31 days, followed by February, which has 29 days this year, and then March, and so on. The Jewish calendar starts in the spring, in the month of Nisan, which has 30 days, followed by Iyar, which has 29, followed by Sivan, and so on. And here's the problem with this calendar. It has 353 days in it. It's 12 days shorter than the solar calendar. Well, to fix this, every 2 or 3 years, an additional month is added to the end of the year called Second Adar to make up for those missing days. So every 2 or 3 years, there's a leap year. But what does that have to do with this discussion? Well, using the Jewish calendar, Passover is the 15th of Nisan every year. And I know that you'll hear Passover is a week long, but it's actually the Feast of the First Fruits. It's a week long, immediately followed by Passover. And if you don't believe me, go read Deuteronomy 16. A monk named Bede in early 8th century England actually came up with the date for Easter, and he wrote, "The Sunday following the full moon, which falls on or after the equinox, will give the lawful Easter." So when is the equinox, you ask? Well, the equinox is when the sun crosses the equator. And in the case of Easter, it's when the sun is moving north. So what have we learned here? Well, we learned that Passover falls on the 15th of Nisan every year. When that day actually moves about 12 days each year with leap year adjustments every 2 or 3 years. Easter, at least for the last 12 to 1300 years, falls on the first Sunday following the first full moon of the vernal or spring equinox. And based on this, it moves around within a 30-day window, and that's a moon thing. And finally, and in my mind most importantly, Easter and Passover are not the same thing. Jesus was alive for the Passover meal and died at the end of the day on Passover. Easter is 3 days later. I hope this helps. Thanks for taking the time to watch. As always, I pray that you got something out of this and that God has spoken to you during these few minutes of time that we spent together. If you like what you saw, give us the old thumbs up. More importantly, I would encourage you to click the subscribe here box, subscribe to the channel, and tell someone who needs to hear it about the channel. This is out there for people to use. Thanks a lot.